When you imagine space warfare, maybe you think about this.
Star Wars.
But what if I told you it actually looks like this? Using satellites that detect heat signatures, Space Force Guardians track enemy missiles from the moment they're launched, giving troops an early heads up and cueing air defenses. They optimize GPS to help the US hit targets with precision, and they help keep the entire US military connected through secure satellite communications. Guardians also deploy equipment that can target and degrade an enemy's space systems, blinding them to the battlefield. Now, the US has used space capabilities to fight wars for decades, but technology is advancing rapidly, and space is becoming way more competitive. General Saltzman served as the second ever head of Space Force.
I'm always worried about maintaining our advantages in space, but that's because that's my job to worry about those things.
Before his retirement, I got the chance to ask him how Guardians played a key role in major operations over the past year. And we talked about how rapidly evolving technologies and threats will redefine space warfare over the next decade. General Saltzman, thank you so much for sitting down with us. It has been a very busy year for the US military, and we've heard everyone from the President of the United States to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff praise Space Force and space capabilities for just being essential to operations in Venezuela and also Iran. What did this past year mean for Space Force?
It's a little bit of a validation for me. You know, like when the balloon goes up and we are really called on to do incredibly difficult military operations, and when the other services who have decades or centuries of experience turn to the newest service and go, are you a part of this team or not? You can't equivocate. You can't put a bunch of caveats. You have to say yes or no. And we said yes, and we delivered. We can argue about the political objectives that are achieved, or, you know, I'm not here to argue those. I'm saying that the military effects that we were called on to produce, we were able to generate under fire, and I'm extremely proud of that.
It has been publicly stated that US space capabilities were targeted and destroyed for the first time during Epic Fury. Is there anything you can say about that?
It should stand to reason that if we were a critical part of the operation, that the adversary would be trying to remove us as being a critical part. So we fully expect to be contested. And that's just a friendly way of saying we expect to fight to preserve the capabilities that we are providing to the joint force. And that means counteracting, mitigating threats against our forces.
Is that just a reflection of how important space is to the US?
Yeah, it's really a part of the Space Force origin story. What became clear over the last couple of decades, to maybe people that are outside the internal business, is how important space is, both for national security reasons, operations like we're talking about, but just our economy. The fact that you can get on your phone, synchronize with some server somewhere, and shop online, and then go to your bank and transfer money to get that purchase, that's space-enabled technology, that's space-enabled capability. So the criticality of space to the American way of life and our security has become more pronounced. As a result of that, threats have emerged. Other nations try to take those advantages away from us. They also see how important it is, and if we can deny those advantages, we might have a military advantage. And so the combination of the criticality of space with the rising threats means you have to have a service now to think about that on a day-to-day basis. How do we protect what we have and deny an adversary using space against us? It's a natural evolution of this technology, I think.
You put out a really fascinating document about the future operating environment in 2040, which is the year that China aims to have space power parity with the US. Can you just paint a picture of what space could look like in 15 years?
A transparent world where everybody can see everything. A heavily contested electromagnetic spectrum. That's the RF energy that surrounds us all, and you can take advantage of it with jamming and communications links. It's going to be heavily contested in the future. On orbit, proliferation, lots of satellites, lots of countries that have access to those satellites. That means overflight. There's going to be systems that fly over our country that we may not want to look into our country, but it's going to happen. We have to be ready for it. We're going to need advanced missile technology, missile defense technology. This is where you see Golden Dome, as an example, come up. So we're looking to what the future could look like and making sure we're designing our systems to address the threats and still accomplish our missions in that future.
I found the document to be somewhat alarming. given what it says about adversaries' potential intent in space. Did you intend for this document to be scary or an eye-opener in any way?
I intended it to be practical to the military planners whose job it is to think about the worst-case scenario. If our military planners said everything's going to be fine, there's no real threats out there in the future, then we're not going to be ready if something does go wrong. I have to prepare for potential threats, not realized threats. Are these potential threats? Yes. Am I trying to scare anybody? No. I'm trying to say we got to prepare. We have to make sure that we have the capabilities, the training, the equipment in order to respond should any of these threats become real. Because once they become real, it'll be too late to respond to it.
Both China and Russia are expected to remain space powers, but in very different ways. Can you just explain a little bit about what China is potentially going to do and what they want to do versus Russia?
It's even broader than space. It's about what their worldview is, how they see themselves positioning for the future. And I think you see in the PRC, they want to transcend the Western Pacific region and become a global power. So I think they're looking at their space capabilities with that in mind. How do they project power? How do they project influence? How do they make sure they understand and have indications of warning globally, more of a global presence? I think Russia is still thinking about kind of the near or far. They're still thinking about NATO. They're still thinking about having good defenses of their immediate region. I'm not discounting the fact that they're putting global space capabilities up that we have to attend to, but I think you just see different aspirations between Russia and the PRC, and as a result, their space capability takes on those characteristics.
And China seems to have more resources.
Well, they certainly have a faster growing economy, and they're willing to put that economy against building space capabilities.
Right. In this document, you have charts that show the number of satellites China is expected to put into orbit.
Correct.
How big is that number?
It's very large. They are pursuing proliferated constellations, mega constellations, the kind you see with like Starlink. There's a tremendous advantage to operating as close to Earth as possible. You just have to have a lot of satellites to take advantage of it because they're so fast around oversight. You go from horizon to horizon in about 12 minutes. So in order to have constant coverage overhead, you have to have a lot of satellites. So they are pursuing the proliferation. They're also pursuing reusable boosters like we see with SpaceX and what Blue Origin and some of the other providers are also pursuing. That reduces the cost of launch, which is what contributes to the number of satellites they're able to put on orbit.
Can the US keep up with those numbers when you're looking at the expected launch 10 years from now?
I mean, I appreciate the question. I do. It's just, it's not a race. It's not who has the most is the best. It's probably not as good a question to say, can your industry support your aspirations? It's about what missions are you trying to accomplish? How many satellites do you need to accomplish those missions? And can you put that number of satellites on orbit and then replenish them as they reach end of life? And if the answer is yes, then it doesn't matter whether somebody has 2 more than you or 3 more than you. There's not a better country on orbit in terms of launch capabilities than the United States right now. I'm very comfortable that we have a lead in the launch business, which means our aspirations for putting missions on orbit are met by the industry we have in place, and we'll continue to invest in that and grow it. So I'm comfortable that when I need a mission on orbit, I'll have the launch industry to do it. Will the PRC? Yeah, likely.
So you're not worried that China could overwhelm the US with the number of satellites?
I'm always worried about maintaining our advantages in space, but that's because that's my job to worry about those things. And I'm worried about the aspirations of other countries who have demonstrated an ability to try to deny us our capabilities on orbit. That's what's worrisome.
Which China has.
That's exactly right. So it's not about how many satellites can they put on orbit, it's what do they want to do with those satellites. And the fact that they are fielding operational weapons on orbit, that's what gives me concern because they're going to try to take our advantage away from us.
Can you describe a little bit the importance of different orbits? We're talking about low Earth orbit, but there's also geosynchronous orbit, there's highly elliptical orbits, there's lunar orbits. Where does it stop?
Well, the technical answer is it doesn't stop. In theory, there's an infinite number of orbits. The real question is, what advantage does an orbit have? Just because you can circle the Earth doesn't mean you can accomplish the mission that you're intended to. There are certain orbits that have a lot more advantage for users on the Earth. Low Earth orbit, because it's closer, high fidelity imagery, think weather or a commercial imager. Higher fidelity means more clear, more data, because it's closer. But you've got to manage the fact that you have to switch which satellite you're looking at because they're overhead and they're gone and you have to keep moving around. They have to communicate with each other. Those create complications, which until very recently, complications that we couldn't afford to try to overcome. So we used geosynchronous orbit for missile warning or satellite communications because it stares at a particular spot on Earth. So you could have a big antenna that just pointed to that satellite and it never had to track, it never had to shift. It just stared at that point out there in geosynchronous orbit. So very valuable, and you didn't have to have as many satellites, which was also important when launch was so expensive. Medium Earth orbit was kind of a combination between the two. We use our GPS satellites in medium Earth orbit. So they move relative to a spot on the Earth, which creates an advantage for navigation, but you don't have to have so many of them like you do in low Earth orbit because they have a larger vantage point from that orbit. The highly elliptical orbit is fascinating because it was a compromise between a satellite that hangs over a spot in geosynchronous, but the Russians figured out, because so much of their country is in the northern latitude, a geosynchronous, which has to be around the equator, didn't have the best line of sight into Russian landmass. So they built this thing called a highly elliptical orbit. So it shoots out to more than 23,000 miles, but instead of hanging over the equator, it hangs over Russia. It hangs over the northern tier before it comes back around. It was a way to get like a geosynchronous staring satellite without actually being at the geosynchronous equator.
Are we going to see more satellites in that orbit now that the Arctic is increasingly important?
Yeah, it's not the same as a polar orbit. It's actually inclined at 63 degrees, but it does give you a polar view that you don't get from geosynchronous. So it's kind of this kind of hybrid between the two. And then there's planes in orbits. It's how many different hula hoops do you want to put around the Earth to make sure that there's always a satellite overhead. So you're in low Earth orbit, but where in low Earth orbit are you relative to other satellites? And so you put multiple planes for GPS, you put multiple planes for Starlink, so that you can manage how many satellites are available so that on the ground you can always see the number of satellites you need for continuous coverage.
One thing talked about in the future operating environment document is the ability for satellites to shift orbits.
Yeah, dynamic maneuver is, I think, going to be a feature of the future operating environment. One of the things that we do that has worked for years is you take an observation of a satellite. Think about a radar that gets a hit on a satellite, it returns back and says, that's where the satellite was. At this time, there was an object there, and you do that a couple of times and you can figure out what orbit the satellite is in around the Earth. And once you have that orbit figured out, it's very predictable. And we use that for space traffic management. We presumed that the satellite wouldn't maneuver if we didn't know about it. If the satellite is continuously maneuvering, that becomes very difficult because now it's not a predictable orbit. It puts more demand on the sensors to update, figure out where that satellite's going to be. So the more dynamic the orbit is, the harder it is to do the kind of space traffic management, the kind of flight safety, you might say. And if an adversary wants to hide a satellite, using dynamic maneuver is an example of a way that can make it harder to keep track of where all the satellites are.
Metamaterials is also a way they can hide a satellite. What are those?
Think signature management. The idea of in the future that you might be able to not get a radar return from a satellite, not be able to see it visually because we're trying to hide it in plain sight. Use the sun at your back. A telescope can't look into the sun and see a satellite. So how do you maneuver when the sun is at your back, and when does that happen? So all of those things you can do are gonna be future capabilities that we'll have to contend with because they'll want to hide, they'll want to do things without us observing them, and if they can get around that just with basic physics, then they will.
Another technique you guys mentioned in this document is high altitude platforms. So balloons or drones or aircraft. Those aren't in space, but they have implications for space.
Here's the way I describe it. Aerodynamic properties break down above about 100,000 feet, give or take. So 100,000 feet, you don't have enough air for aerodynamic principles to hold true. But you haven't got high enough yet where you can apply astrodynamic rules. It's hard to maintain an orbit at 105,000 feet. You have to be going so fast, and there's so much resistance still at those speeds. You have to get really above 300,000 feet. You're up around 60 miles, 62 miles. Okay, you can start to have orbital mechanics take over. Well, that means between 100,000 feet and 300,000 feet, not good for airplanes, not good for satellites. So what is it that operates in there? So it's ripe for consideration about a placement. And this is where you get high altitude balloons because they can operate there. So what can you do with them? And I think that's ripe for operational concept development. And how do we take advantage of that space?
You talked about the line of sight, but those are beneficial because they extend.
Yeah, the
a
higher you
country's
go, the
line of
better your
sight.
line of sight is. Even in land warfare, you want to be on the high ground. So altitude matters in warfare. And so if you can take advantage of all those layers of altitude, it changes the characteristics of weapons and protection capabilities.
Changing topics, the moon. Why is the moon important in this future of space?
It's a higher altitude. So geosynchronous orbit, about 23,000 miles. It's about 10 times geo to get to the moon. So if you think about the advantages that geosynchronous orbit gives us, now you're 10 times that altitude, and gravity still works between the two, right? So anything you drop from the moon is eventually going to return back to Earth at those kinds of speeds. That vantage point, the cislunar orbits, create a different way of looking back at our planet. Not to mention, does the moon itself have anything to offer? Right. Minerals and economic benefit to being there. But I think about it as just one more altitude that I have to account for. And if you can put spacecraft there, if you can put communications equipment there, God forbid somebody wants to put a weapon in one of those orbits, I have to account for it.
The threat would be potentially putting a weapon there, potentially just having more capability there?
I mean, putting a weapon there, it doesn't do anything.
Right.
Right. But think about communications. Think about the vantage point. I don't even really know all of the missions that we can do yet there, right? I'm still kind of landlocked in my thinking, but the engineers are not. They're thinking about what are the advantages? How do you take advantage of gravity? How do you take advantage of communications from there? If you were looking from there out, what do you see that we can't see from here because you're different sun angles? There's just lots of new factors when you start thinking about the moon, particularly if there's going to be a permanent presence on the moon.
Which is something we expect.
America is returning to the moon to build a moon base.
The administrator of NASA, Jared Isaacman, certainly thinks that a moon base makes sense, that having a permanent presence there is in the national interest. And where national interests grow, the Space Force is going to go to continue to protect.
What about electronic warfare?
The electromagnetic spectrum, we can't take for granted that we will be able to use it the way we want to use it. For any kinds of communications, any kind of data links, think about cell towers that have to communicate with each other so that your phone stays in constant communication. Those are all RF links, radio frequency links. And if they can be interfered with, we should assume that when we are in a contested crisis situation, that they will be interfered with. So now what? Now what are you going to do? The idea of unrestricted just means you can't count on the RF bands being sanctuary anymore. They're going to be contested. How are we going to mitigate that? How are we going to get around that?
How do you?
I think there's lots of techniques. You make sure that your antenna is hidden so somebody doesn't know you're communicating. Things like laser communications use different parts of the spectrum, which make it harder to jam. You do satellite crosslink communication before it comes to the ground, so you need less terrestrial connections and you use on-orbit connections. You hide your pathways, because if you can hide the pathways, then the jammer can't get into the link and interfere with it. This is just the way warfare always works. There's always a counter.
Another thing that's captured a lot of people's imaginations is Golden Dome, space-based interceptors, intercepting missiles and other objects from space. Why is it important to put interceptors in space?
Two main reasons. One is global coverage. You don't know where the missile is going to come from. And if you don't know where the missile is going to come from, you have to have a sensor that can detect it very rapidly. Satellites are perfect for that kind of persistence, global coverage. And that's what you get from satellites that you don't get from airplanes. Airplane, you got to put them in the right place to see, and you have to have so many of them to cover an area. The second is how fast you have to get the knowledge of that launch or that missile to a decision maker and to an effector to be able to mitigate that threat. That data transport can't rely on terrestrial networks or undersea cables. It's too slow. It's just not going to work. Yeah. So having the ability to move data from on orbit is also a very important thing. So you start to look at what it takes to put the sensor, an effector, and the data communication all together to achieve an effect on that missile, and you're really talking about a space capability. That's the characteristics that it has.
And missiles are changing.
And missiles are changing. Yeah, from the hypersonic reentry vehicles, the things we've seen the PRC demonstrate, all the way down to even things that are not missiles, drone capabilities and cruise missiles and hypersonics. That technology is changing very fast, and we have to be able to change our sensors and evolve our sensors to be able to counter those threats.
Another technology that's moving very fast is AI. What are the opportunities of AI in space and what are the threats?
It allows us, I think, to take advantage of mass amounts of data, make sense of them quickly, and then be able to act on them and make an operational decision in a relevant timeline. If you were relying on people to do that, you couldn't process the data fast enough. But there's going to be too much data. And you need all that data in order to do the kinds of things we're talking about. Match a satellite's orbit to an effector to a target that's moving from a launch location that you don't know about. And I think it's the kind of things that machines do better than humans. Now, you'll still need a human in the loop to make that final determination, I think. But that's far easier when all of the upfront work has been done for you at speed.
What about threats? What are you worried about when it comes to AI in space?
Everything that we can do with AI, an adversary is going to be able to do as well. We have to be ready to protect our systems against cyber vulnerabilities. We have to be able to protect our systems against a fast-thinking adversary. Our decision loops have to be faster. So that means our sensors got to be a little better. Our data transports have to be a little better. Our decision makers have to be ready, trained, ready to make those decisions. I think there is an advantage we have as the U.S. is we trust our workforce in the military. The GPS constellation is flown by 20-year-olds. I mean, if you went to the GPS ops floor, you would see people that have been in the military 1, 2 years, 3 years, and they're responsible for the entire GPS constellation.
Wow.
We trust them because we train them, they're smart, they're responsible, and so we can push those decisions down. I think that gives us a decision advantage. If everything has to come up to the highest levels of decision making, it's going to be slower.
Are there any firsts in these conflicts that you can talk about?
The scale with which we saw like missile warning events, I wouldn't call those a first, but we've reached a new order of magnitude. For example, the number of missiles that we've characterized launched in both Ukraine and now the Middle East. I'm an old missile warning operator from way back when. We've seen more in the last 3 years than all of the years before that combined.
Wow. And can you just lay out how that works? When a missile is launched, what do the Guardians see and what happens?
So satellites orbiting the Earth detect heat. There's a couple of interesting characteristics about a missile launch. One is they're very hot, as you might expect, a rocket engine, and they also accelerate. So when you have something hot that's also accelerating, it looks like a missile from the sensors in space. That data is transmitted back to our operators. They can look inside that data and determine exactly what kind of missile it is, what kind of range it has. They can characterize the ballistic trajectory of that missile, which allows them to determine where it's going to impact. Once you have the impact point, then you can start backward engineering to figure out what's the defensive asset that can maybe intercept the missile, Patriot battery or THAAD battery. And that allows them to take those actions. And more importantly, it says, hey, this is the impact zone. So if you're not a part of the missile defense, you probably need to seek shelter.
So Guardians are basically getting an early heads up that a missile is being launched.
Well, not only do they get an early heads up, they're responsible for giving everybody else the early heads up. So in a very short time frame, a satellite can detect that heat plume and that it's accelerating and characterize the missile.
One of the more interesting things that happened during this war was Iran fired a ballistic missile at Diego Garcia. It was a missile that could go longer than any other missile Iran had demonstrated before. Was that an aha moment for the Space Force and for the Joint Force?
No, because it's our job to characterize the capabilities of missile. We don't have to see them perform to know what their characteristics are. We watch our adversaries build missiles. We watch them build multi-stage missiles. We characterize the potential range. My job is to prepare for worst-case scenarios, not necessarily intent or demonstrated performance. So we're the what-if people. What if they launch a missile? What if it's capable of achieving these ranges? And we play the worst-case scenario out, and we make sure that we have capabilities to defend in those circumstances.
So it was not surprising to you?
Not surprised.
What other functions besides missile warning did Guardians do and operate during the war?
Well, I think the one that the American public understands the best is GPS. The ability to do precision navigation and the maybe more essential function of timing standard, creating a timing standard for the world.
Yeah, but why is that important in war?
Because you have to synchronize a lot of computers. You have to synchronize communications. If you're not on the same time standard, you can't synchronize. For everybody on the planet to understand exactly what time it is at exactly the same time gives us an advantage, and GPS performs that function for everybody.
And how does that translate to dropping bombs or flying combat missions?
That timing standard is what creates precise pinpoint accuracy. And so once you know what time it is, you can actually look at different satellites and say, well, this is where we must be for this time coordinate to be synchronized. So with precision location, you can then track, coordinate, and target very precisely. So operations like Midnight Hammer, where you require very precise targeting to get into deeply buried targets, that doesn't just happen passively. The operators for GPS take advantage of knowing exactly when the bombs are going to be put in place, and they figure out how do we sweeten the constellation to make it as accurate as possible in this time, at this place. Once they do that, then it kind of degrades back to the normal state of accuracy. Right?
So you can make it better.
It's hands-on. It's not passive.
You can make it perfect.
That's exactly. You can make it as perfect as possible in time and place.
And how does that help hit a bunker buster bomb hit a small target?
For somebody that's about to throw the first pitch out at the Nationals, accuracy counts, right? And so the difference between hitting the catcher's mitt and throwing it 3 feet wide makes a big difference.
Right.
And now imagine that play out on a larger scale. We're not just trying to hit a place on the earth. We're trying to hit something very precise.
Right.
And so you have to have that pinpoint accuracy to be effective.
Why is it important to develop alternatives to GPS or position navigation and timing?
Because it's critical and an adversary wants to take it away from us. In order to maintain the things that are important to us, it has to be resilient against attack. I don't presume that we can stop all attacks from happening. That's why we use the word resiliency, not redundancy, not replacement. Resiliency, meaning the effect can be maintained even under attack. We can take a punch, we can continue to do the mission as reliably as possible.
There are these pictures of dishes that can be deployed on the back of vehicles. Are those moved into theater before any operation? Are those part of what's doing the electronic warfare?
There's different kinds of electronic warfare, but if you're talking about space electronic warfare, we use those antennas to focus the jamming signal, if you will, up to a satellite on orbit. And those are greater distances, and so you have to have an antenna to focus that energy.
And those are called non-kinetic effects.
Yeah, non-kinetic meaning we're not intending to destroy the target, we just want to disrupt it or degrade it.
And is it reversible? Can you stop doing it when you want to stop doing it?
Of course.
So you can go in, jam signals, jam a satellite, and then
stop jamming.
Does the enemy know you're doing this?
They usually pretty quickly learn that they're jammed.
Something's off.
That's right. The system is not working as it's designed. Now, whether or not they know exactly who's doing it, exactly where it's coming from, and whether or not they can mitigate it, that becomes more of a problem for them.
And does it matter where in the world you are when you're doing that? Do you have to be close to the battlefield or close to the satellite?
Generally speaking, the term we use is line of sight. For RF energy, it's being shot out of an antenna, and it has to point at the target antenna. That's how you create that jamming interference signal. And those two antennas have to be within line of sight of each other. So when we talk about space electronic warfare, it's interesting because a geosynchronous satellite, if you're on the ground that can see that satellite and communicate with it, you're in the line of sight. And so that line of sight to space is a long distance, but you still have to actually technically be in line of sight of the antenna.
And then jamming ground stations that receive information from satellites is another way you can do this, is that right?
Right. The antenna that's trying to receive the communication signal, you're putting extra energy into it, just like if I was talking to you and we're having this nice communication, but then somebody was screaming over top of me right at you and your ears are trying to sort out my words from all of that noise.
Like my children.
It's the exact same concept. All you're doing is pointing your interference energy at the antenna that's trying to receive the signal.
Are there any other functions, before we move on, that you would point out Guardians were responsible for during those operations?
There's satellite imagery that we take pictures of the ground. We've recently started to use commercial imagery. It's the space operators, the Guardians in the theater that look at all the capabilities that are available to us, whether it's commercial side, whether it's military side, whether it's the National Reconnaissance Office, or whether it's other agencies. NOAA operates weather satellites. And so the Guardians that are in theater in our service components are there to make sure that all those space capabilities are fully integrated into the plan and accounted for. And they're the most knowledgeable people to say, this is what will work well here. Here's the limitations. It's not going to provide you this data that fast, for example. And so they make sure that the plan is practical, executable, and accounts for all of the capabilities that can be brought to bear.
On that note, something really interesting happened during Epic Fury. Journalists like myself, who couldn't report freely from the ground in Iran or even US military bases in the region or warships, We relied on satellite imagery to see what was happening, what was being hit, how the war was playing out, and at some point the US cracked down on commercial satellite imagery. Why is commercial satellite imagery so problematic for the US?
Well, I'm not sure I would phrase it that way. I would say anytime we see dissemination of information that could put our forces in jeopardy, put them in danger, we're going to take action. We protect our forces. If a journalist is too close and is going to see something and report on something that could create vulnerability, we pull them out of that area. The problem is satellites are so ubiquitous now. The commercial imagery, it's out there covering every surface of the Earth, every part of the Earth at all times.
And it's getting better and better.
No doubt about it. And so it's just a new world now. It's a new era where we have to account for this.
How do you train all of these guardians for all of these crazy things that are expected to come in the next decade or so? Do you need more people for this new era of space?
Sure. We're doing new missions, and new missions are done by new people because we're not abandoning any of our missions. We're continuing to do all the things we've always done. So every time a new mission comes to us, I have to think about that in terms of more capacity, which is more people, more buildings, more resources. And to some degree, that's why we submitted such a large budget proposal, is we need to start growing the size of that force. We don't have combat experience in space yet, thankfully. So we don't have a lot of the lessons learned that you might get if you were on the front lines in Ukraine and you're an infantry officer. So we model it and we simulate it, and we do our best to put them in what we think is going to be the environment they might face, and they practice in computer simulations. We are actively building what we call the operational test and training infrastructure. It's nothing more than a series of computers that help build a virtual computerized environment where we practice our tactics with the systems that we have as high fidelity as we can. They practice those tactics against a thinking adversary. Does this work? Does that work? How fast do the maneuvers take place? And if we can build high enough fidelity.
It's like a flight simulator.
It's very much like a flight simulator. And I think that's probably the best analogy, is the more you can do it in the flight simulator, when it happens in the real world, you'll have some of those reps and sets on your belt, and you'll be better prepared for when it happens live. We built a generation model. How do we generate forces to get ready for this future environment? Turns out that flying the GPS constellation on a day-to-day basis doesn't really prepare you for a high-end fight. So we built a model where the operators come out of their day-to-day activities and train in simulations and in ranges for the worst day of GPS.
Space Force is almost 7 years old. You have been the chief of space operations for 4 years. How has the Space Force grown up under your watch?
I'm so proud that I feel like we've done a couple of things. One is, when I took over, I was getting questions on the Hill. I was getting questions from a reporter like, why is there a Space Force? Tell me what the urgency was to build this Space Force. We all did a lot of education on, here's the threats, here's why this is so important, here's the criticality of space. And since it's critical and since there are threats, you have a service now that wakes up every day trying to train and equip and make sure that we have the doctrine and the operational concepts, and we're practicing to make sure that we can protect and defend those capabilities against adversaries trying to do it harm. I don't have to say that much anymore. You know, I explain details, and I certainly advocate for resources, but we're over the hump explaining that we need a Space Force.
What are you going to do in retirement? Are you going to be
We're
able
going to go golfing, right? And
I would love to go golfing. Okay. I'll hold you to that. Can you step away from all this?
No, it's in your blood. I don't think any general officer worth their salt could say they can just walk away. Too much invested, too much blood, sweat, and tears. I will always make myself available for anybody that wants to talk about the Space Force. Whatever I've learned over 35 years is ready to come back and give back to this institution. So I will stay involved. It will be on a far different time and schedule than I currently have, but no, there's no way to walk away completely.